generally speaking, the history of North America is rather odd. Looking at the continent of North America, you find that it is, or at least it seems initially, to be almost completely impoverished of any kind of ancient history. Now, the mainstream historian will immediately fire back and say, no, wait a second. There are North American Indians here, and they have a great long history on the continent. This, of course, is wrong. All it takes is 2 seconds of studying real North American history, and you very quickly discover a common pattern. All of their histories eventually lead to the exact same point, that they arrived in North America not that long ago. And to make it even crazier, when they arrived here, there were already people living in North America. This, of course, is ignored by the mainstream. Now, I'm not going to go into any of this, but I just wanted to get that out of the way so that we can just, move on with life. So if anybody wants to try and be a smartass about it, you have no choice but to acknowledge that no, North American Indians do not have, a million years established on the North American continent. And to make it even worse for the mainstream historian, the North American Indians that we are now familiar with, they were technically the invaders to another existing culture. And in fact, according to their own stories, it was not just one culture that they invaded. It was multiple different kinds of cultures. Now, to make things even more crazy, when we look back at North American Indian history, and we try to use what they say to get a grasp on what the hell was going on in the continent of North America, generally speaking, we find another common denominator that is completely ignored by the mainstream. The North American Indian tribes that we know nowadays, that currently persist nowadays, they say that not only did they arrive in North America and run into other cultures, but the reason why they even traveled to North America at all was to escape a cataclysm. So with just these couple of points in mind, I've already begun to paint a completely different historical picture with respect to the North American continent. Now, the North American continent is a weird one, not just because of the stuff I just talked about, but because if we look at the continent just generally speaking, if we try to, when we look at North America, we find North America is in a completely different state relative to all of the other continents on this planet, historically speaking. What I mean by that is, generally, when we travel all over the world, we find that all the other continents, for whatever reason, they are absolutely covered with all kinds of evidence that relates to all kinds of ancient cultures. I mean, it's crazy everywhere you go, right? You look at Africa, we have all kinds of structures there. You look at Asia, all kinds of structures there. You look at Europe, same thing. I mean, everywhere you go, South America, it literally does not matter. For whatever reason, all these other continents that you travel to, you will find megalithic structures, or if not necessarily megalithic, you will find impressive structures. Let's put it like that. For example, I don't know if you really want to call the pyramid a megalithic structure. You could probably debate that. Anyway, my point is that we find history, like evidence of actual history, real human history, all over the planet. When we travel to North America, we find a completely different situation. In fact, we find what you could almost consider a blank slate. And of course, once again, the common historian is going to start screaming at me, "No, there were Native Americans here. They were here for 8 trillion years. Once again, that's not right. But it's interesting to note their real history in relation to what I just said, to North America being almost a blank slate. Because if you look at the North American Indian populations the kind of populations that we are generally familiar with now, not the ones that came before them or anything like that. That gets a little weird as well. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit. But when we look at those populations, how did the Europeans find the North American Indians living in North America? Were the North American Indian tribes building huge civil engineering structures everywhere? Were they planning out gigantic metropolises? I mean, were they engineering all of this crazy stuff on North America to create some kind of a crazy futuristic civilization? No. No, they weren't. They weren't doing any of that. When the Europeans meet the general North American Indian, what they find is they find a people who are basically still in a survival mode. It's almost as if they had not yet had time to really settle down and start to engineer any kind of a solid 100% rooted down civilization. Now, mainstream historians will say this did not happen because, well, let's be honest, mainstream historians believe North American Indians are just stupid savages. I mean, that is literally what they believe. Right? That is how they approach the North American Indian culture and the history. Right? They defend it. They'll say, oh yeah, they're just one with nature and all of that stuff. But what they're really saying is that, oh, they just weren't smart enough to be like the Europeans. I mean, let's just call it for what it is. And I'm just going to do that. That's what a mainstream historian thinks about a native or a North American Indian. Nothing could be further from the truth, though. These people were just as intelligent as anybody else on the planet. So it begs the question, why had they not started to settle down and started to invent and started to grow and started to plant roots? Why hadn't that happened yet? Well, of course, if we just look at their history, we can find out why. Remember, their own histories state very specifically that they are relatively new to the continent as well. So that's the first thing. They simply had not had time yet to do any of that. Now it gets even crazier because remember what I said earlier. When they arrive in North America, they are not alone. All right? They are not arriving and immigrating to the continent and becoming indigenous, quote unquote. They find themselves facing off against other civilizations. So what happens? Well, once again, all we have to do is listen to their history. We find a situation to where a lot of the North American Indian tribes that arrive here end up having to go to war with these other cultures. And there's a couple reasons for that. There's one side of the coin to where some of these North American Indian tribes were just warriors. They were conquerors. Yeah, mainstream historians don't like to talk about that, do they? But yeah, when some of these guys arrive over here, they immediately start to fight. And they immediately start to try to take over land from the existing populations. Yeah, this is the stuff that mainstream history completely ignores now. I mean, they just absolutely want nothing to do with it because, of course, there's a whole psychological program going on with our society, and our society is being engineered to be weak and all that garbage. And this is part of it. Like, this is one of those things that's being done. This is one of the divide and conquer tactics. Okay, I know. I won't get schizo. Okay, anyway. So we find a situation to where, yeah, warrior-like tribes enter North America and they start fighting. Right? And these fights are not easy. If we listen to their stories, there are some serious wars going on. And I'm talking about straight up war, not little skirmishes where like 20 or 30 people. We're talking thousands of soldiers essentially fighting each other in North America, and they're doing it a lot. Now, so we have that going on. So if you're constantly fighting a war or fighting wars and you just arrived on a continent, you know, how much time are you really going to have to sit there and try to build up huge high-tech cities? Yeah, it's not really going to happen because there's war going on, right? There's conflict constantly happening. The other side of the coin is, of course, that there are peaceful tribes that come over as well, and they actually integrate with some of the other existing tribes. And of course, this leads to the creation of entire new cultures. And then as these new cultures start to grow, they of course get into conflict with other cultures, right? It could have been the warrior type cultures. It could have been two other cultures that had grown up together and then they split off. There's all kinds of North American Indian history out there that talks about all of this, right? It's all there. If you don't like anything that I'm saying, by the way, don't come after me. Go yell at the Paiute. Go yell at the Sioux. You go talk to those guys, right? Go talk to the Adina. I'm just telling you what their history records. That's all I'm doing. I'm not making any conclusions. I'm just taking what North American Indians say seriously. When you do that, everything changes. So when the Europeans show up, what do they find? Well, they find cultures that have been going through all kinds of different cultural changes. They've been going through all kinds of war. And ultimately, all of this had been preceded by some kind of a great cataclysm. Or I should say, technically 3 cataclysms that would lead up to this point in history. However, there's only 2 that are going to technically matter. And the 2 cataclysms that we have to deal with are the Venus event cataclysm, which is dated to around, 2.5 to 3,000-ish years ago or so, and which will essentially bury North America, or at least large parts of North America. And then what I'm now calling the Zero event cataclysm, which will happen after the Venus event, and which will essentially set the stage for history as we know it. The Zero event cataclysm is dated to, around 1,000 years ago or so. Now, if you're wondering how that jives with the rest of history, if you're a mainstream historian or if you believe in mainstream chronology, it doesn't work at all for you. It just won't line up with anything. And the reason why is because there are so many different kinds of phantom centuries and millennia that have been added to modern history that everything is scrambled. So that date I just gave you is not going to make all that much sense if you're going to try to compare it against modern chronology. But if we use and employ real chronology and real science and real history, a completely different picture emerges. Anyway, I don't want to get in too deep into that catastrophe. We have a lot to talk about with respect to that catastrophe. We'll do that on other shows. I'm going to focus on North America. I've got to stay focused. I am focusing on North American history. Okay, so essentially, there was a catastrophe that took place between 800 and 1,000 years ago that once again changed planet Earth. Just to make this clear really fast for people who have been paying attention to this channel or have been wasting their time listening to this channel, this is not the Venus event. The Venus event or the Venus catastrophe would have taken place about 1,000 years before this event. Give or take. I don't have exact dates. That's another thing with real chronology. I mean, that's why chronology exists as a science at all, is because we just don't have the kind of dating system that the mainstream likes to lead you to believe that we have. It's just not there. So I can't give you guys 100% solid dates, and I apologize for that. I mean, that's what the research is for. That's what I'm trying to do here. Okay, so North America. All right, so we've set the stage. Essentially, North America, for whatever reason, is a very fresh and pure continent by the time Europeans show up. When they show up, they find the North American Indians in a state of, they're still in survival mode. Now, they're in a calmer survival mode, to be fair, because a lot of the stuff that I had just talked about happened long before the Europeans showed up. Or not even long before. A lot of that stuff had started to settle down before the Europeans had shown up. So while there still was conflict amongst tribes here and there, it was nowhere near to the scale that they describe that had been taking place centuries before when they first arrived on North America. So we have an interesting problem. We have a situation to where we have an entire continent that is not full of megalithic structures. It is not full of all kinds of civilizations with tens of thousands of years of history. We instead find North America almost as if it had just been completely resurfaced and is relatively fresh. We do not necessarily find a situation like this on any other part of the planet. Now it begs the question, why? What I want to do today is I want to show you guys some very interesting archaeological and geological evidence that has been discovered over the past couple of centuries that prove that the North America that we see today was a completely different area only 1,000 years ago. And I mean completely different in the truest sense. Now, the interesting part is that we would expect this to be the case if North American Indian histories are true. Now, if we take them serious, then we suddenly can expect to find exactly what we do find in North America. The weird thing about North America is that North America really does appear to have been completely resurfaced relatively recently. And by recently, I'm talking, say, 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. It was not that long ago that this took place. Even more crazy, we can actually drag the Atlantis story into this a little bit if we would like to have some fun. Because, when you start to study catastrophism and you start to look at the geology and you start to look at the plasma science, you start to see that whatever North America looked like, 2,000 years ago, it looks nothing like it does now. Like the shorelines that exist right now, there was no such thing. It wasn't even like a soft outline. There was a completely different situation existed. So let's get into the evidence. I know I've been talking for like 10 million hours, but I want to cover this stuff. In North America, one of the things that has been discovered, and of course geologists either don't talk about it, or they have these other ridiculous explanations for these things, and archaeologists as well. What has been discovered in North America is that anywhere between 40 to several hundred to 1,000 plus feet under our feet right now in North America, we discover an entire other world buried under the ground that we currently walk on. And this is a scientific fact. It's almost as if some huge giant thing came along and dumped a ton of material all across the entire North American continent. That is quite literally what these discoveries begin to prove. Let me go over some of the crazy discoveries that have been found, and then let's see where that takes us. And then we'll start to build up a case that maybe backs up what the North American Indian tribes talk about when they say, hey, look, we showed up here after a cataclysm, and we found other people who were also trying to survive from the cataclysm that had just struck us. Let's see if we can find scientific merit for those stories. If we can, several things then have to be acknowledged. If we can use North American geological and archaeological evidence to prove that something happened relatively recently, what that means is that the rest of the planet must have also suffered. The good news with that is that everybody else on this planet also talks about the same damn catastrophe. So what we will then be able to prove is that something crazy happened to this planet very, very recently. And of course, it was just the last thing to happen in a chain of several absolutely insane events. Okay, so let's travel dozens to upwards of 1,000 feet underneath the strata of North America. One of the crazier things that was discovered when people started to bore well holes all over the eastern side of the United States was that these drillers were starting to discover that when they would go down past a certain level, say 60 to 80 feet, they were constantly running into trees. This gets weird because why the hell are we finding trees buried under 40 to 80 to 100 feet of dirt? Now it gets crazier because when they started boring these well holes and they start drilling into these tree cores, these trees were not fossilized. These trees were not solid rock or something like that. What they were finding is they were finding trees that were standing upright, still rooted into the ground, and they were still regular wood. They had simply been preserved under the ground. When they would take some of these tree core samples out of the ground, you could literally still burn them because it was just wood. So it started to beg the question, why the hell are we starting to find what appears to be all kinds of buried forests under North America? Let me give you some examples of some of the forests that have been found underneath the peat and clay layers and rock layers and gravel layers of the North American continent. Now, first we travel over to the Mississippi River Valley. Over here, we find all kinds of what geologists will call quote-unquote fossil forests. The problem is that these forests, once again, they're not fossilized in the sense that we normally think of fossilization. They just use the term fossil to say old. You know, that's another problem that I've noticed nowadays in science, is that the term fossil, like, there's no actual definition for it anymore. Like, I've seen the term fossil it's been applied to everything nowadays. It's been applied to like living tissue. I mean, it's been applied to rock. There's no consistency anymore. I mean, it's just nothing there. It's just okay. So what they started to find in the Mississippi River Valley is they found all kinds of buried forests that were only thousands of years old underneath all kinds of sediment in the Mississippi River Basin. This is key. These trees, the main stream, were willing to say that they were thousands of years old. How do you like that? They weren't millions of years old. They were not billions. They were not hundreds of thousands. The main stream had no choice but to admit that the trees that they were finding down there in the Mississippi River Valley, they were only at best a few thousand years old. Now, if you haven't heard about this, I'm not surprised, because this is the kind of stuff that makes zero sense when it comes to the mainstream zeitgeist. A mainstream geologist has no way of explaining how a forest could be buried under upwards of 100 feet of mud and gravel, and the trees are only 1,000 years old. Where the hell did all of this debris come from that could cover an entire forest like that and could cover it up to the depth that they're covered to? Because right now, mainstream geology says, oh, well, you know, it takes millions and billions of years for layers to build up over time. And of course, they don't want to factor in erosion, because erosion counteracts their little millions and billions of year thing. But we'll ignore that for right now, geologists. Don't worry, it's fine. I'll just keep moving on. Anyway, you need millions and billions of years to grow that kind of a stratification, right? How do you build up a strata that is upwards of 100 feet thick in less than 1,000 years? And of course, the answer is obvious. You need a catastrophic event to accomplish that. There's no other way around it. The theory of uniformity is not going to supply us with the time or the energy or the material to build up that kind of stratification. It's not going to happen. So the Mississippi River Valley Basin is a serious problem for geologists, and it's one they ignore, right? It's one that they're not going to dive into, because what happens is that, you know, ultimately, if they really are going to be academically honest, they have to admit that something tremendous happened. Think about that for a second. I said up to 100 feet, and it gets deeper too. We're going to get into deeper trees and stuff like that. Let's just say 100 feet of sediment burying a forest that is only 1,000 years old. That's insane. I mean, that could you imagine 100 feet of material essentially just rolling towards you somehow and just burying your entire city right now? 100 feet of crap? I mean, that is a ton of material. How do you get that kind of material moving? How do you get any of that going? What force could make that happen? To make matters worse is that geologists can't use any kind of lamination or stratification or any kind of excuse, by the way, to explain any of this, even in that 1,000-year period, because the trees appear to have been buried instantaneously. And this is also a key piece of evidence. We find this fact all over the planet. What we find not only in North America, but all over, I mean, everywhere on this planet, we find evidence of this. But we find all kinds of evidence that these forests, not only were they buried, but they were buried instantly. They did not even have time to get knocked down. That is how fast this material was deposited on them. It's essentially just imagine a huge sprawling forest, and then just imagine a ton of dirt appearing right on top of it out of thin air and just falling straight down. That is literally what the evidence shows. There's no way around it. So where the hell did all this material come from? And how the hell do you move that kind of material? And you're going to tell me that happened only a couple of thousand years ago at best? How does that line up with anything that mainstream historians talk about at all? You cannot ignore this. Now, it's funny. The North American Indian stories line up with this perfectly, right? In fact, everybody's histories actually line up with this perfectly. Everybody just ignores them because it sounds crazy. What I just said is crazy anyways, about the forest, right? How are you going to get that kind of... How are you going to bury a forest like that? It's mind-boggling. But the funny part is that all of our ancestors talk about times in the past to where some kind of crazy catastrophe, or catastrophes, we should say, depending on the time period, assaulted this planet. Right? Everybody talks about it. And of course, everybody in the mainstream ignores this. Okay, let's keep going on with the evidence. I know, I'm just complaining now. Okay. Let's go over to Pennsylvania. We find another forest buried under layers of sedimentary rock. These trees were perfectly preserved due to rapid burial from quote-unquote ancient floods. Now we're starting to get a little bit of scientific information. Because if we are going to bury something quickly, we need a force to push it. And one of the greatest forces on the planet that we know of that can do stuff like this is running water. Now, of course, you can say, well, it was a tsunami. Yeah, and hey, that's thinking in the right direction, isn't it? A tsunami absolutely can move material. And we have videos of tsunamis now, so we can kind of watch and see the power of a tsunami. But we do not have a single video of a tsunami hitting anywhere on this planet and generating upwards of 100+ worth of debris and stratification during the tsunami. What this tells us is that if we are going to blame some kind of water action, some kind of a tsunami situation, we have to multiply the size of that tsunami like thousands-fold. Right? This is not a little simple earthquake that happened off the coast and it rushed in a tsunami and oh yeah, it sucked, but it's just a tsunami. It happened forever ago. It's not like that, is it? Right? You have to explain how upwards of 100+ feet worth of garbage got on top of a forest instantly. How do you generate a tsunami 100 feet tall? Well, the tsunami itself would have been way taller than that. I'm just talking about the debris. The tsunami has to deposit 100 feet of debris. That means that rush of water, can you imagine how tall that rush of water must have been? And the fact that it happened only a couple of thousand years ago? Yeah, it changes everything. It changes all of history. All of that stuff that we learn about, all this garbage, like Egypt being 5,000 years old and, there's all these dynasties and all that garbage. It changes all of that. How does it change that? Because if you have a tsunami that is upwards of 1,000+ feet, and this would have been miles actually, you would have had to have had miles high worth of water doing this, the entire planet is going to feel this event. Right, so whatever mainstream thinks was going on 5,000 years ago, everybody's just basically peaceful, and there's maybe some wars, but nothing crazy going on. No, whatever was going on in our past was completely destructive. I mean, it was obliterative destructive. Everybody on the planet would have felt this. All of the history in the mainstream is completely wrong the very second you find catastrophic evidence like this. Because if you have North America being assaulted by miles high mountains of water rolling over the East Coast, that means the entire planet is in trouble. That means the entire planet, something's going on. Nobody is walking away from this unscathed. right? It just doesn't work. So that means that all of the history, all of the chronology, it's funny. This evidence right here quite literally disproves all of mainstream chronology scientifically immediately. Because you cannot have these kind of events without the entire planet feeling them. That's it. Okay. Let's move on, shall we? Okay. So if we keep going, we also find entire ancient forests, including all kinds of stumps and logs that are also found up there in the Alaskan fields. Now, these Alaskan permafrost fields are amazing because they also contain drift layers. And drift layers have literally hundreds of feet of shredded plant and animal life buried right there. Hundreds of feet of shredded plant and animal life. This plant and animal life is not millions and billions of years old. This plant and animal life is only 1,000, maybe 2,000 at best. And it is permanently frozen up there in Alaska. Once again, we find another situation to where something under the ground, an entire forest where forests do not exist now. We have entire landscapes which are literally submerged under hundreds of feet of detritus and layered stratification. It's all there. It's almost as if North America was a completely different continent only 1,000 years ago. And I mean that in the truest sense. What this would also imply is that the rest of the planet would have also have been different. That means shorelines would have had to have been different. That means that the way, areas right now that are essentially inhospitable, you cannot inhabit them anymore. Back in the day, apparently, they were fantastic to live in, right? For example, you have areas up in Siberia. We know that Siberia, only 1,000 years ago, by the way, was a warmer climate. Right? And this would actually go a long way into explaining Tartaria. And we'll talk about Tartaria again in a different situation. But the implications of just the North American catastrophe, just the evidence for what happened in North America, completely changes everything. All right, so, okay, keep going. Let's go down to the south. Over there, they're down in the Gulf of Mexico, right off the coast of Alabama. They found huge old cypress forests beneath 60 feet of water and sediment. Huge cypress forest literally off the coast of Alabama. What was going on in Alabama 1,000 years ago to where there was a teeming, huge, dense forest where there is now ocean? We have no choice but to scientifically acknowledge that the entire continent of the North American area was completely different geologically. The evidence is right in front of us. So when we start to look at the North American continent, we can easily just say, scientifically, that the mainstream is completely wrong. They're insane. I know, I'm just yelling into the mic at this point. All right, so it gets worse. Let's travel up to Delaware Bay. In Delaware Bay, once again, we find remnants of a submerged forest that was uncovered beneath sediment layers offshore. Now, right now, mainstream scientists, of course, they blame climate change and rising sea level and, the ice age. All stupid, all dumb, no reason for any of that. Not a single one of our ancestors' histories talks about any of that. All of our ancestors' histories talk about a cataclysm, okay, or multiple cataclysms. I'm just talking about the last one that our planet went through. What the hell am I even talking? I've gone way off course. All right, let's keep going. Okay, so those are forests, and we find this all over the place, right? These ancient forests, they're all the way up until the Midwest of North America. What this proves, and it proves it scientifically, and there's no way around this. It's impossible. There's no arguing with me, by the way, is that only 1,000 years ago, up to 100 feet under the ground we stand on now, there was an entirely different world where people were maybe living and where animals were living. It's completely different. Everything was 100% different. That immediately changes history. We have to acknowledge that. Okay. What about artifacts? What was going on over here in North America? Now, I kind of mentioned Atlantis. Okay, before I say anything else, I only mention Atlantis not because I believe Atlantis is a weird one. The only reason why I even mention Atlantis actually nowadays is because the scientific evidence actually demands that continents sank relatively recently. And I'm not even talking 10,000 years ago. I know alternative people right now love that date, right? They try to, it's the Atlantis Ice Age cope, right? It's like, oh yeah, the Atlantis existed, and then that magical time period called the Ice Age also existed, and the ice melted, and then Atlantis sank, or whatever. You know, it's dumb. It doesn't make any sense. The Ice Age never existed, so we don't have to suppose the Ice Age. There's no Younger Dryas. I swear to God, if I hear anybody preach about the Younger, you know what? We're gonna make a show that just goes off on the Younger Dryas, so that we can just get rid of that garbage cope theory. I call it the Younger Dryas cope, because that's all that theory is. Anyway. The reason why I mention Atlantis at all is because it's entirely possible that if that part of the continent existed, or if that continent, quote unquote, existed, it may have actually connected to some part of North America. And obviously I'm not the first person to say this, but it's something to think about, and it's a very real possibility. Now, where it gets weird is that so far as I am aware, we have not found some kind of a crazy Atlantean artifact anywhere yet. Right? And I know people can try to point to stuff like maybe the Bimini Road, or maybe something down there in Florida. And maybe that might be legit. I don't know. I personally have not seen the scientific evidence to corroborate that stuff being legit. And the other problem that we have to watch out for is that everybody and their mom wants to prove Atlantis existed, so they'll grab onto anything, right? I mean, people will take anything and make it Atlantis. And that's what happened. Okay, I'm not gonna go off on that. Anyway, it's just interesting. So think about that. If this gives credence to something like Atlantis. So if you're an Atlantis researcher, looking at the evidence that I'm giving you here, and just go look this stuff up. I'm not going to go into great detail. We'll do other videos that maybe focus in on each one of these little subjects, because there's a lot here. I just wanted to scream into the mic for an hour. Apparently that's what I wanted to do today, and now I'm accomplishing that. How do you like that? Just wasting my time and wasting yours. All two of you that made it this far. Okay. All right, okay. Anyway, so Atlantis, something to think about. Anyway, we would maybe potentially expect that there may have been human settlements living in North America, in the North American area, whatever it looked like back in the day. Because don't forget, it doesn't look, whatever North America looked like back then, it does not look, whatever North America looks like right now, it did not look like this back then. And I mean that in the purest sense. Whatever the shorelines were of North America, there's no comparison to today. So just keep that in mind. Okay. Where the hell was I? We were talking. Oh yeah, wait. Okay. So artifacts. We would assume maybe, and maybe, I guess you would think possibly that there would be human civilization in the North American area during this period of time, and that of course, if anybody was living during that period of time, they would have been wiped clean. And what's interesting is that we actually do find artifacts from these depths. So basically, whatever event took out all of these forests would have also taken out the human inhabitants. And we find this. One of the things that we find all over the place in North America as well that a lot of people are not aware of is that we find all kind of mammoth bodies everywhere, all right? And they're not preserved in the sense of Siberia because it's not freezing down there, but we find mammoths all over the place. It's crazy. We actually find mammoth bodies. They found some mammoths, I believe it was in the southern part of the United States. I forgot the area, but they found an entire herd that was literally still standing upright when they were covered in the debris and the detritus of whatever the hell overtook them. Even more interesting, they actually found a couple of the mammoths who were in mid-step, like literally frozen in dirt, mid-step. And it's even crazier because they were looking behind their backs, their skulls were twisted around to where they were looking northeast, almost as if whatever was coming to bury them came from the northeast. Yeah, I'll have to dig that up for you guys in another show. I just want to go over the basics. Okay. Another thing that they found was the Nacro Mammoth kill site down there in Arizona. They found stone tools and mammoth remains that were unearthed under 30 feet of sediment, which, to mainstream scientists indicated some kind of human activity at least 13,000 years ago for them. For us, it would have only been 1,000, maybe 2,000. And it also would have depended on the time period and the advancement of the people during that time, because those people would have been dealing with a catastrophe that would have happened earlier than even that. So, stone tools, by the way, stone tools get weird. The reason why stone tools get weird is because, let me give you an example, how stone tools can be mistaken for time periods. So right now, let's just say I go out in the mountains right now, and I'm out there with my backpack having fun. I've got all my technology. But let's say, I don't know, something on my backpack needs to be broken off. Like my zipper messed up, and I need to bang it back into place. So I grab a rock, and I bang my zipper back into place to where it's straight again. I know, bad example, but basically what I did is I used a stone as a tool, even though I have a cell phone and sunglasses and shoes and stuff like that. So I bang that into place, and then I throw that rock behind my back, and I never see it again. What happens when an archaeologist 200 years from now finds that stone? They would say, oh, look at this. Oh my goodness, I found a stone tool from the Stone Age of 13,000 years ago. I mean, look at it. They obviously used it as a tool, right? It was only me a couple of hundred years ago, but that archaeologist has no way of knowing that. They just automatically believe that a stone tool is the Stone Age, which makes it 13,000 years ago. Yeah, that's how stupid historians are. That is what they do. Okay, anyway, just so when we hear about stone tools, we have to be careful. So, for example, the stone tools that were found with those mammoth remains in Arizona, that does not mean that the people who are carving up those mammoths were Stone Age, cave people. They could have had guns, they could have had laser beams for all I know, but maybe one of the kids decided to smash the skull in for fun with a stone. I don't know. But that's my point, right? You cannot use stone tools to date Stone Age crap. The whole concept of the Stone Age, by the way, is just stupid. Okay, anyway, keep moving. Another thing that they found beneath all of the sediment is they found a Calico early man site. Essentially, more stone artifacts were found buried beneath dozens of feet in sediment down there in California. So California's, all of this, the entire United States, there's stuff buried everywhere, dude. It's absolutely crazy. All right, okay. Obviously, the Great Lakes copper mines, these are important too, because what they did is they found a ton of ancient mining pits and tools were buried beneath sediment layers around Lake Superior. Now, these right now are associated with prehistoric copper extraction. As far as the mainstream is concerned, they think this was going on 5,000 years ago or whatever random stuff. But isn't it interesting? Now, we all know about the Great Lakes copper mines, and we need to talk about that one day as well. But it's interesting to note that they found buried under all kinds of sediment an ancient mine that would have predated probably the mines that we're talking about existed, maybe only 5, 6, 7, 800 years ago. Yeah, dude, history gets crazy. It's funny, man. It's almost like, people... okay, anyway. Let's keep going. So over there in Illinois, what they started to do is they started to drill cores, right? Like I said, they're one of the big ways that a lot of this was discovered is people are just drilling cores. Once again, down there in Illinois, they found tons of wood and tree fragments from hundreds of feet below the ground, suggesting that there was a deeply buried ancient forest. And they have found tons of those. With respect to human discoveries with these forests, one of the wells that was drilled actually brought up a chunk of a tree that still had the axe cuts from an iron axe embedded in the tree. Now, the iron had mostly rotted away, but there was still a chunk of it stuck in the tree. What are the implications for that? I mean, think about what that means. Basically, they found an axe sticking into a tree and they drilled this up. What that could have meant is that whatever civilization was hanging out in that forest at that time, they could work iron, and they actually found a steel one as well. I'll just go with the iron one. But they could work iron, and the guy who was probably cutting that tree down was in mid-strike as the catastrophe buried him. That is how quick this catastrophe happens. Now, if you are going to have that kind of a fast catastrophe taking place that is essentially burying an entire continent, you are going to need some kind of a crazy event. And of course now, it certainly seems like the Venus event is the event that would have buried all of North America. Well, okay, not all of North America. It would have been the event, the catastrophic event, that would have done all of the damage. So basically, it seems like the East Coast up until the middle part of the United States, Canada kind of area, that area seems to be extremely flooded with all kinds of debris, mud, etc. Right? And don't you start with me on the mud flood. Okay, that's not what's going on here. But whatever happened there, it was a tsunami that has never been seen since. And this would have been that 5, 6, 10, 12 mile high mountain of water that the ancestors of the North American Indians recorded seeing. Right? Remember, there's all kinds of tribes who have a recording of literally watching a mountain of water rolling over the continent, and they describe it wiping out everything. Right? There were not a lot of survivors. The survivors who did survive, yeah, shut up. The survivors, they were able to see it from a distance. The reason why they were able to see it is because the mountain of water was so high. It really does beg the question how high that mountain of water truly was. I still want to try to figure that out. We'll have to dig into that later. Anyway, if you're going to have an entire continent being, buried, not an entire continent, a chunk of the continent being buried with all kinds of debris, you need something like this. The Venus event seems to line up historically and scientifically with all of this evidence. So, this leads us to other findings. Over there in Missouri, in the Missouri caves, deep excavation in the caves started to find all kinds of human artifacts and human remains buried beneath extensive sediment layers, dating back only a few thousand years. Now that date is a mainstream date, right? That's not a real date, but the fact that the mainstream is willing to say that there is this deep, these caves in Missouri contain human remains, and they contain tools from humans under extensive sediment layers. Something happened. I mean, why is this ignored? It's right here. Okay. I know, I'm just going crazy. We've just been talking for 12 million hours and we just keep going. All right. You know what? Okay. You guys get it. All right. Well, here. Okay, hold on. Let me give you a few more examples and then I'll shut this down because we see all this stuff. I didn't I didn't even know. I guess this show is not working out at all like I thought. But all of this stuff, all of this evidence, it just shows you that North America was completely different back in the day. And that explains why we find the situation with the North American Indians and the Europeans essentially coming to a continent which was fresh, right? Because it had been recently buried, and the last catastrophe pushed everybody that was around the area towards North America purely for survival purposes. Now, here's some interesting finds that they found buried deep in North America, and then we'll wrap this garbage up. One of the crazier things they found was a bunch of iron pipes buried in coal seams down there in Illinois. Now, this is a huge controversial one, and I wish we could get the dang real hardcore evidence for it. But miners all over there in Illinois, they kept coming back during the 19th century saying that they keep discovering iron pipes embedded in coal seams at significant depths, often exceeding hundreds of feet. Okay. They also describe the pipes as being arranged in like regular geometrical patterns, resembling a manufactured design rather than being any kind of a natural formation. Right? Sorry, iron pipes do not just magically form naturally. That's not how that works. If you're going to have geometrical, I mean, what is this? These pipes are crazy. So anyway, they find that kind of stuff down there in Illinois. Over there in California, when they were digging for gold, they found all kinds of crazy artifacts buried in the mines as well. And remember, they had to dig into these to find them, which means that the artifact was solidified in the stratification. So what was found over there in the Sierra Nevada mountains, they found advanced human tools and human artifacts buried beneath lava flows and deep strata. Now this is a good one, because up until now we have not mentioned lava flows. Now the lava flows, I guarantee you, was created by the Venus event. In fact, the whole resurfacing situation was probably the Venus event, with the zero event coming in later and just kind of mixing everything up and setting the stage for what we see today. Are you confused yet? Yeah, right? I'll do a chronology of the catastrophes. I know, we got to do that. Okay. Anyway, they find those artifacts under lava. How are you going to find human artifacts under lava? What that means is that an entire civilization existed in North America, and then lava magically appears and rolls over it. Now I say magically appears because remember, there are no volcanoes to explain the amount of lava discovered over here in the northwest and western half of the United States. There's no such thing as a dead volcano that can pump out the kind of volume of lava that was discovered here. And just to give you an idea, we literally find upwards of 1,000+ feet thick of a lava field that covers multiple states. All right, and there are no volcanoes in the area that could create it. Even if there was a volcano, have you ever seen a volcano create a 1,000-mile high lava flow? No, 1,000 high lava flow is insane, right? It's crazy. It's even funnier, by the way. North American Indian tribes, they actually have stories about the earth, actually that lava happening, and that, okay, that's a whole other story, but they actually have the history of that. Right, just like they have the history of the giant mountain of water that rolled over the continent back in the day, that would explain why all of this stuff was buried. All right. You know, another thing they found over there at Table Mountain, for example, they found mortar and pestles and all kinds of other artifacts buried beneath 30 feet of volcanic deposits over there in California. It's just this stuff is everywhere. What the hell happened in North America, and what the hell was going on? Now, one thing to note, so far as I am aware, nobody has found any kind of futuristic technology under any of this stuff. Now, I realize that, you know, had it been found, the government would grab it and all of that, fine. But, you know, the reason why I brought up Atlantis and I wanted to mention it is because if Atlantis existed during this period of time, pre-Venus event, and then the Venus event comes, takes everything out, you know, this would be a way of showing us the technological level that Atlantis would have existed on at that time. And we're not finding anything crazy. So just something to keep in mind. I'm not saying that there isn't crazy stuff with Atlantis, but I'm also saying that, you know, if we can keep our expectations, you know, based on science, then we can actually make better discoveries that are realistic. That's the only reason why I say that. Anyway, isn't that crazy? I mean, look at North America. You know, North America, the planet has gone through 3 major catastrophes. We have the Saturn nova. We have the Venus event. The Venus event would have been responsible for the resurfacing of the planet. Of course, North America would have been resurfaced with it, and that's what this evidence proves, everything I just talked about. And then there's the zero event. The zero event cataclysm is what sets the stage for modern history. This is why we find ourselves, all of us, if you're a human on this planet, this is why you find yourself where you are now. The zero event is what will set the stage for history now as we know it for the past, say, millennia or so. Little less than a millennia, more likely. So that's North America. I mean, that's like real North American history. Have you ever heard about any of this stuff talked about whenever you watch the Learning Channel or whatever? Does that even exist anymore? Nobody talks about this. And this stuff cannot be ignored. Mainstream historians cannot do history of North America without acknowledging all of these catastrophic events and how the North American Indian tribes corroborate these events on top of every single other human on this planet having their own catastrophic stories from their perspectives that, of course, would have also happened simultaneously with what happened and took place in North America. We have to reevaluate everything. Now, for those of you wondering about the mound builders, yeah, let's wrap this up. Okay, but let's close this in a nice little bundle of chaos and stupidity. And yeah, okay. We have cultures like the mound builders, right? We have cultures like the Adena. We have other cultures which the North American Indian tribes record that are not what you would consider politically correct today, right? For whatever reason, North America in the past 1,000 years has had all kinds of races apparently living here, some in peace, some in war. And some of these races apparently no longer exist. When we look at the mound builders, they're a problem. The reason why the mound builders are a problem are twofold. The first problem is we don't know who the hell they were. Now, a lot of mainstream people will simply say, oh yeah, they're the North American Indian tribes. They did all of that. But then you go and you look at the North American Indian tribes' history and they say, no, we did not build any of that stuff. It was a completely different civilization that built all of these mounds. So we're at a now we have a serious problem, right? Because North American Indian history never lines up with mainstream history. So what about the mound builders? Well, the mound builders are interesting because apparently they were larger people. I hesitate to use the term giant, but, you know, what do you want from me? When the Europeans show up and come over, they start finding giants in all of these mounds. Now, the mound construction itself is interesting as well. Mound construction is, you know, at first you think mound construction is basic. It's just a pile of dirt and whatever, right? And there's a little truth to that, sort of. But construction with dirt, there's a whole science to that, by the way. Like building, like for building our freeways and stuff like that, for piling up dirt, you know, there's a whole science there. You don't just grab a bunch of dirt, throw it on there and be like, okay, we're done, you know, pave it over. That's not how it works. Right? There's a science to doing that, and these mound builders apparently had that science. Because when you take core samples from those mounds, the dirt composition is actually designed to maintain the shape for a long time. Like it was designed for longevity. Anyway, but it's still dirt. It's not huge blocks like we find over there in, you know, Göbekli Tepe, I guess, sort of. But, you know, it's not like Egypt. Right? It's not like South America. You know, it's not like any of that. It's just mounds of dirt. What's interesting about the fact that that culture, whoever they were, built using mounds of dirt instead of possibly building out of stone or something like that, is that if they were coming out of the cataclysm of the zero event and they were picking up the pieces, one of the easiest ways, you know, they could have built would have been using dirt. They got plenty of dirt. They would have been coming out of a cataclysm, which means their access to resources, both human and regular, you know, just usable resources, would have been extraordinarily limited. And of course, coming out of a catastrophe, you would have lost all kind of knowledge as well, because tons of people died. I mean, hundreds of millions of people died during that catastrophe, by the way. And that also explains why we find the genetic traces that we find now, and that also explains why we see the population numbers that we find right now. But I digress. Anyway, the mound builders make a lot of sense relative to catastrophe because the people who the mound builders were, they weren't idiots, obviously, but just because you're not stupid, that does not immediately guarantee you have access to, you know, high-tech stuff. So they did their best with what they had coming out of that catastrophe. Where did they go? Well, that's the other interesting thing as well. We would expect, and well, not expect, we know for a fact this happened, For whatever reason, in the past 1,000 years, especially after the zero event, the vast majority of megaflora and megafauna died off. Something to note on the side is that a lot of the forests that are buried in North America, they're not small trees like we find nowadays. These trees were megalithic trees. These trees were no joke. This was serious growth. Right? These are not little bitch trees. They were huge, thick trunk trees. Right? Whatever, it was a megaflora. After the zero event, for some weird reason, megaflora and megafauna lack the ability to continue to survive. If the mound builders were bigger people, as far as we can tell they were, we have pictures of their bodies, we have countless, testimonies about what people found in there. If you have a 12-foot tall person, we now know today that if you're 12 feet tall, it's a bitch to get around, right? It sucks. And the reason why it sucks, well, one of the main reasons is because of Earth's gravity. Is it possible that before the zero event, Earth's gravity was slightly different? And that is an actual scientific possibility. After the zero event goes down, suddenly you find all of this megaflora and fauna either dying suddenly, in some cases, or very slow deaths in most cases. This would also corroborate with all of those stories about finding giants moving really slow, not being able to think very quickly, etc., etc. It's entirely possible that the mound builders, while they survived the cataclysm, the last major cataclysm, genetically they were incapable of carrying on throughout the centuries. And that's why they died out. And there's some truth to that once again if we look at Native American stories. Right. Isn't that crazy? I mean, North America is insane. Right? We'll go over more evidence for this later because there's so much to cover. But you like this schizo? Yeah, it's good schizo stuff, but it lays the foundation to at least show all of you guys that there is crazy stuff going on in North America, and it completely disproves anything that the mainstream currently uses for its chronology and for its history.